For courses exploring the foundation of modern philosophy, as well as live events bringing philosophy to life, visit Philosophy Portal online and become a member today. Throughout 2024, our members get access to 4 monthly events. In January, we focus on the concept of libido and welcome guests Layman Pascal, Alenka Zupancic, and Elliot Rosenstock. Find out more at philosophyportal.online. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here with Dr. Matthew Flisfader. Dr. Flisfader is an associate professor of rhetoric and communications at the University of Winnipeg, where he teaches courses on communications theory, popular culture, critical theories of discourse and ideology, as well as critical studies and social media. We're here today to discuss his recent book, Algorithmic Desire Toward a New Structuralist Theory of Social Media, which was published in 2021. This book uses the concept of social media as a metaphor for interpreting the dominant ideology and consciousness of contemporary neoliberal capitalism. It's been a while, Dr. Flisfader. I know we've wanted to discuss this for some time now. First off, welcome to the channel. I really enjoyed the book. How are you doing today?
No, I'm great, Cadell. I'm really happy that we're getting to do this. I know we've been trying to get together to do this for a while, but I really appreciate you having me on your channel to talk about my book.
Fantastic. I think I just want to start with the way you start the book, which is with this provocation about the concept of social media. Is social media really that social?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I guess what I'm trying to do from the outset of the book is develop a kind of an immanent critique of the concept of social media, or I call it the metaphor of social media, because I'm trying to keep it within some a Lacanian analysis of the rhetoric of social media itself. I mean, one of the things that I think is useful about the idea of social media as a concept is that it works methodologically as a measure for understanding some of the problems with the platforms that we are using on the internet, what we used to call Web 2.0, and the way that social media helped to give a new kind of structure to the free flow of internet communications. First with social networking sites, and then with the concept of social media. I think that one of the first things people will say when they're using platforms like Twitter or Reddit or others, that these are platforms that are making us more antisocial, that when we use the platforms, we end up in different types of feuds. There's the problem of trolling. There's the problem of feedback loops or feedback bubbles, fake news or post-truth, whatever you want to call it. So when we talk about social media, I think the first reaction for many people still today is that these platforms are making us more and more antisocial. But I really want to stick to the idea of social media, because I think that it's only via the concept of social media that we're able to then evaluate and measure the degree to which the platforms are doing the opposite of what they're said to trying to accomplish. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to stick to the concept of social media, even though I'm very, very pessimistic about the ability of these platforms to create any kind of social interaction.
Right. I think it's one of the great contradictions of our time, that at the same time as we have this ubiquity of social media, we have sort of symptoms of isolationism. We have symptoms of people feeling like, there are some reports that people don't even have don't even have one friend. There's some, what's coming to mind is that book that went viral, Bowling Alone, where we have this symptom of friendlessness, and at the same time, you've got 1,000 friends on Facebook, but no friends in real life. What do you think are the sort of emancipatory possibilities of sticking to this concept, social media, and really thinking it through in the way you're trying to do in this book?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I haven't actually thought about that Putnam book for a very long time, Bowling Alone, because it always reminds me of sort of, if I'm remembering correctly, sort of a Habermasian public sphere type of orientation around the social. Um, so I think, you know, the way that I'm thinking about this sort of imminent critique of social media is to really point out the fact that these are platforms that are driven not so much by the social, but more so by the business interests of capital. So one of the things I begin in the book is by arguing that it's not social media that's making us antisocial, it's actually the dynamics of 21st century capitalism. And throughout the book, one of the things I try to argue is that one of the benefits of analyzing social media via this concept is it gives us a way to understand some of the contradictions of a particularly neoliberal capitalism. And there's something about neoliberal capitalism that it creates these enjoinders to encourage us to think more and more as individuals in competition with each other, in particular, that most of our activity, not just on platforms, but in society more generally, is one of investing in and enhancing our own particular individualist sense of self, because it's the means by which we procure some kind of life or living in the society of neoliberal capitalism. So I think that these are the incentives that are really built into the design of the platforms, both the platform layouts and the algorithmic organization of the platforms. It's interesting what you said about people not even having a friend, right? And part of the issue for me, and I don't know if I get to it too much in the book, but part of the issue for me is that because of the way the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism creating the sense of very staunch individualism, we come to think of other people either as our competitors or there's a kind of an instrumentality perhaps that comes with other people. They're friends only to the extent that they can serve the individual particular interests of each individual user. Now, when that happens, I think that there's a sense that there's a kind of a breakdown or decline in a general sense of trust. I mean, anybody who has, real world friends, right? Not platform friends, but real world friends knows that the main thing that creates that sense of friendship and solidarity with other people is a degree of trust. You're allowed to be vulnerable with other people. And I do think that there are ways to, develop those kinds of friendships on platforms where you can be open and trustful and vulnerable. And I have people that I've met on social media that have become good friends in that way. Not so much with the outward type of posting that is visible to the general public, but more of the kind, some people call it the call-ins, right? So as opposed to a call out, a call in, you can, write private messages to different people and have, more, a deeper kind of interaction that allows you to be vulnerable in a certain way that helps to build that sense of trust. But on the whole, I think that because of the way in which the platforms are designed, they really create these incentives that are geared more towards individualism and the breakdown of trust.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many points there that are sort of bringing up connections with some works I've been investigating lately, specifically, when you're situating this concept of social media in the context of understanding 21st century capitalism. What's coming to my mind is Yanis Varoufakis's recent book on techno-feudalism and what killed capitalism. And I just wonder here about his thesis of these tech platforms, like you already mentioned, Twitter or X now, Facebook, and so forth, as actually undermining the dynamic of markets and profits, and actually sort of instituting a different type of sort of feudal regression, where we're now sort of serving feudal lords, in some sense, paying rents, like, for example, on X or things like that. Do you see a similar trend? Do you see the similar relationship between neoliberal capitalism and feudalism, or do you have a different analysis here?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. And I guess I'll say that I'm still a bit skeptical about the neo-feudalism argument. What I think is perhaps a better argument is that what we're really seeing, not just with the tech industry, but with 21st century capitalism generally, is just the continued dynamic of the same sort of incentive that we've seen throughout the history of capitalism, acting primarily in towards the profit motive. Now, one I think is very important, kind of tying back to my own methodology in the book, is something like Marx's Capital, if I'm going to go that direction. What I really love about Marx's Capital, and I don't think that it's talked about this way enough, is I see it largely as an immanent critique of the bourgeois ideology, the immanent critique of bourgeois ideology, a kind of a liberal humanism in the bourgeois ideology that is premised on the values of freedom, equality, individuality. And what Marx shows through his material analysis of the capitalist mode of production is that the capitalism itself, which is also created by the values of bourgeois liberalism, freedom, equality, and so forth, that in material practice, what the capitalist mode of production actually does is it undermines those bourgeois values. It prioritizes the value of individualism and sacrifices the values of freedom and equality. And this is something that I see happening throughout the historical trajectory of capitalism and even today. So for me, the dynamic that I really see unfolding is not so much a transformation of capitalism into a new kind of feudalism, but more so just, I guess if I wanted to use the Deleuze-Guattarian language, that there's a form of deterritorialization, more so at the ideological and social level than necessarily at the infrastructural level of the capitalist mode of production. I think that what we're seeing is a breakdown of the traditional bourgeois liberalism and new forms of reactionary ideologies that are becoming prominent. But in my view, I think that the capitalist mode of production is alive and well and acting in the same way that it always has. It's right now, we could call it an interregnum if you wanted to use that language, that we're in the process of the breakdown of one form of hegemonic order, and we're sort of, what we call the, culture war or ideological struggles. I think that we're seeing different forms of reactionary or extremist ideologies on both the left and right that are right now vying for the new hegemony. So that's more so what I see happening today, and I remain a little bit skeptical about the neo-feudalist argument, largely because again, one way to think about, even though there is I agree this dynamic of rent. I mean, I don't think that this was ever not part of capitalism, but when we look at the history of capitalism, there are different moments. I'm a big supporter of Frederick Jameson's, understanding of periodization, historicizing through periodization. And I think in different periods of capitalist development, we've seen different moments where certain forms of capital or certain sectors of capital take precedence over other sectors of capital, and doesn't occur in a linear fashion, but at different moments, as a response to different forms of crisis, we see different sectors taking priority, whether that's a merchant or later an imperialist or a financial stage of capitalism, and even the predominance of rent as the primary means of procuring profit. What I think, if I can just go on just for 1 second, what I think is sort of fascinating about the technological development that we're seeing in 21st century capitalism, and it kind of ties into maybe what some people call not just neo-feudalism, but techno-feudalism. What I think people are largely concerned about is the way that automation, artificial intelligence are potentially coming to replace human wage labor as the means of capitalist production, profit, exploitation. But we still operate in a world where profit is procured via the exploitation of waged labor, right? Insofar as wage labor is still the main means of extrapolating surplus value and turned into profit, I think that we're still within a regime of capitalism. Until that, has disappeared, I don't think we can say that we've really gone beyond capitalism as much as people like Varoufakis would like to suggest. I hope that makes sense.
Sorry?
I hope that makes sense.
No. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And especially on the point of, concerns around automation and AI, I think this sort of really figures as a disruptive aspect of the contemporary economy, and it might actually be one of the dimensions which connects to what you were previously saying about people increasingly seeing each other as just simply reduced to competitors, or seeing each other in an instrumental way, because there is a feeling as if there's not enough space, that there's not enough potential for everyone to differentiate or individuate, and that there's sort of a hyper competition which has been unleashed, and which is only sort of maximized or enhanced through social media, where now there's sort of almost an absurd breakdown of traditional barriers and boundaries. Like, even if I think about the relationship I had with my professors when I was starting my undergraduate back in 2008, versus the breakdown between professors and students now, where everyone's on social media and everyone can sort of see everyone's thoughts. It's kind of like a very weird social situation when you just compare the last 15 or 20 years, and maybe that does contribute to what you were saying in the breakdown of trust. What it reminds me of is Zizek's commentary on Robert Brandam's spirit of trust, and with this idea of a spirit of distrust. um, just maybe get your thoughts on sort of this. How are we to approach I don't know if the right word's overcoming, but how do we approach this tendency or temptation to reduce other people to competitors or an instrumental mindset? I'm thinking here of sort of, I've tried to take steps not only in constructing Philosophy Portal to, let's say, provide a good education, but also to connect with other guys like the guys at Theory Underground, or, and build sort of webs of trust outside of the institutions. I'm not sure if you've sort of have any thoughts on how, like, what is the ethic or the spirit we should be engaging collaborations and going beyond this sort of reduction.
No, that's a great question. So, and I like that you brought up the, Zizek's critique of Brandam's spirit of trust, because one of the things that I get, and maybe others disagree, but one of the things I get from Brandam, especially in his reading of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, I think that it relies still too much on the typical, very liberal understanding of that text. Nobody reads beyond the Lord and Bondsman, right, the master-slave dialectic. And I think that, the popularization of the master-slave dialectic by Alexander Kojève is largely responsible for that. But I see it even still in Brandam, and you can see in his reading of Phenomenology of Spirit that he tries to pick and choose the sections of that text that he wants to read. I think he lobs off the last section on religion and absolute knowing, if memory serves me well. But I think that's important, because if you turn this back to the problem of social media, when we talk about competition, I mean, in some ways, it really does make me feel like everybody is still trapped in this, master-slave dialectic, Lord and Bondsman vying for, now in Lacanian terms, competition over the attention of the big other, that people were all the time competing to get the maximum amount of attention from the big other. And I guess, just to simplify, one of the ways that I think about the concept of the big other from Lacan is the way that, rather than focusing on the specific material gaze of a particular other person, I imagine a virtual gaze of all of the random other people out there, who I don't know directly, but for some reason, as a condition for my own sense of my existence, I try to impress the gaze of that collective big other out there. And that's part of the way in which I attempt to get a sense of myself. So there's a dimension of this, and this, we can talk about it. One of the reasons why I think that social media is very much about the reproduction of a new form of the big other in the Lacanian sense. But as a response, one of the things that I've written about since Algorithmic Desire is how to think about this movement from the focus on the gaze of the collective big other to trying to maintain some kind of close relationship with the small other, the putia, right? The petit autre, in the Lacanian sense. And I think of it in terms of the movement from the Lord and Bondsman dialectic in the phenomenology of spirit, which I see very much as as a way of thinking about trying to impress the gaze, trying to get the attention of the gaze of the big other, to the movement of Hegel's discussion of love in the section on family in Philosophy of Right, which I think is very much about moving from this big other to a small other, right? From the big virtual anonymous other, collective other whose gaze I'm trying to impress. And I mean competition, right? The Lord and Bondsman, right? The master slave that fight to the death in competition for the attention of the gaze of the big other, moving from that to thinking about how I can maintain some kind of solidarity and trust and bond with small other or small others in the plural, if it's that direct relationship with the people who I can trust, who I do invest with a degree of vulnerability. What's Lacan's phrase, love is giving what we don't have, right? There's that dimension of vulnerability that we invest in the small other, even in the sense of the Lacanian analytical discourse, right? That there's something about the movement from the grand autre to the petit autre, from the big other to the small other, that I think is one of the ways we should try to conceive how to move away from this competitive dynamic of trying to impress and gain the attention of the big other into investments with real small others, right? So it's that movement from, again, against Brandam's spirit of trust, right? I think that if we're only focused on the mutual recognition, right? That's the mutual recognition form in the Lord and Bondsman scenario. If we move away from that in the impression of the big other on social media platforms to the small other, that to me is a way to try to actually build some form of material trust and solidarity, and I would call it an authentic bond beyond the platforms.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you followed Samuel McCormick's work. He does a blog called Lectures on Lacan, and actually one of the sort of major themes in his lectures is like basically the big other to the small other. So he's sort of, I think he's picking up on this. He's picking up on this thread that you're identifying as well. And yeah, I definitely think I mean, first just want to say that it's definitely ridiculous that if people only read to the master slave dialectic and the phenomenology, then you're kind of missing, a lot of what's going on there in the phenomenology, right? So yeah, and that limit of mutual recognition and liberalism, I do see that dynamic online a lot, and I do see it as leading to a fundamental tension or a fundamental deadlock, precisely that dynamic of recognition. It has its limits, and precisely needs to be gone beyond. And with what you were saying there in terms of moving away from the competitive dynamic to investment with real small others and networks of trust, does that lead you off of the social media platforms, or can that be done on the social media platforms?
That's a really good question, and I've had my own sort of back and forth with different platforms. I recently deactivated my Twitter because one of the reasons I initially went on to Twitter was to be able to talk about my work, to engage with other people and their work, to have these types of deep conversations, and to evoke and inspire new ways of thinking and build community. And I think that is still, there's in gestation, there still is that potential for the platforms. And I think that it's important in the process, moving away from deactivating Twitter, I've moved on to an Instagram. So I've tried to use Instagram now as a platform to talk about the kinds of things I was doing on Twitter. So I think that there is potential always in these platforms. I mean, they are contradictory, that there's a dialectical dynamic in all forms of media throughout the history of capitalism, too, we should add, right? Because the origins of the public sphere itself are very much, this is Habermas's idea, the structural transformation of the bourgeois public sphere, that there's an interesting and an important dynamic between the development of capitalism and the development of liberal democracy, insofar as in its earliest forms, I mean, these were spaces that maintained a separation, right? That in its earliest form, the rise of the bourgeois public sphere was seen as a space that should be separated. Civil society should in some ways not directly be market society, because we agree that there are civic spaces that we need for a thriving democracy, and we should be able to engage in critical, rational public debate in order to further develop that democracy. But over the history of capitalism, one of the things we've seen, and especially in neoliberalism, is that the more and more these spaces are no longer separated but integrated into each other, that there's a contradiction between the profit motivation of capitalism and the public sphere and media democracy dimension that starts to get undermined. So if we look at, the platforms as they exist today, I mean, people have to remember that, of course, these are platforms that first and foremost are geared towards profit maximization in some way or another, right? I mean, I don't know if all of the business decisions of their owners and CEOs, like Elon Musk, are doing their best job at doing that. But at their basic level, I mean, this is what they are. They are first and foremost businesses, and users contribute to the profit maximization through the amount of work that we do. At the same time, these are platforms that do provide a space for us to engage with each other, to debate, to dialogue in some way. So I think that part of the difficulty is always finding some form to navigate that difficult terrain, right? One of the things Mark Fisher, I think, once said in his Exiting the Vampire Castle is we have to recognize that social media can be a space to develop new forms of solidarity, but we should never forget that this is always enemy territory, right? So, I mean, we have to, I think, think about it in that way, that we can, it's never just, now, I don't always believe, the reasons why I left Twitter are a little bit more convoluted, but I'm generally not for simply abstaining from capitalist spaces. I think that a certain degree of privilege comes with being able to abstain from participation in capitalist spaces. But I think that there is possibility and potential to work through those spaces to develop the kinds of not just class consciousness, but as a Marxist, I say even a socialist consciousness that can help to shed some of the more deleterious aspects of capitalist media.
Yeah, I mean, I think that many people, you're certainly not alone with sort of struggling with, whether you activate or deactivate your account, whether you stay or go. Certainly, I think many people see it as enemy territory. I see this, I see it, I really see the most, let's say, emotionally problematic dimension or emotionally problematic relation to these platforms in regards to dynamics of attentionalism. And attentionalism sort of rides over everything else, and in some sense, if it is the new public square, or if it is the new space where we're having debates and disagreements with each other, it's poorly structured, to say the least. I'm not sure if it lends itself to that in any meaningful sense. But
Well, one of the things, if I can
yeah,
just
go
jump
ahead.
in, I mean, one of the things, Elon Musk, when he was buying Twitter, I mean, this was what he was saying, that he was against the type of, what he saw as forms of censorship that was eliminating this, vision of the town square. But I think we always have to remember that the town square is a public space and that Twitter is a private space. All of the social media platforms we're talking about, really, are corporate social media platforms. These are private spaces that are giving themselves the appearance of being public spaces, but they're never actually public spaces. And what I think, my view is to get to this point where we can re-envision some form of a public rather than private space for the types of communications we're talking about.
I mean, on that point, it kind of reminds me of some of the connections you brought up in the book related to the CCRU, specifically the idea of schizophrenic capitalism. And I think this brilliant idea that really stuck with me was we have a culture without a society. that in regards to the public, we don't have a public square. And increasingly, I have that sort of sense that that there are some memes that say we live in a society, as is a kind of like sort of to confront you with the obvious fact that there's other people. But I increasingly feel like we live in a culture without a society. That we are in sort of a like you say with the CCRU idea of the schizophrenic capitalism you know is social media here, is the internet as a hyper object corroding what we thought of as society? What's your ideas around this?
I guess I would say, I mean, this is where for me some of the interesting early work, the way that Zizek was drawing on Laclau and Mouffe, especially in their book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, when they, I mean, it's kind of, it sounds like it's echoing the famous Margaret Thatcher statement that there's no such thing as society, there is only individuals and families. But Leclerc and Mouffe, and I don't know how much they're really, trying to, upturn the Thatcher statement, but they make this claim that society is not a valid object of discourse. And what they mean by that is that society is never this coherent, fully completely, I'm going to cite a Tragically Hip album, never fully completely closed and self-contained, but society is always fissured by antagonism, that there's always an antagonism that is at the heart of every society. And what Zizek does in his earliest work in English is he takes up this idea to argue that the reason why society is never complete and whole and total is because it's not just fissured by antagonism, but it's fissured by class struggle. That the what he talks about, again, in the Lacanian sense, mirroring somewhat his Hegelian interpretation, is that the central contradiction of every society is expressive of the real, that class struggle is the real of every society. So on the one hand, I mean, we can say that, capitalism is always, schizophrenic capitalism, if you want to draw on that idea, that it's always in the process of constant deterritorialization, right? In the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, that it's always, because every time capitalism reaches this moment of potential stability, that's where profits level off. So it has to find ways to self-destruct and implode, to deterritorialize in order to keep pursuing new avenues of profit making. So in that sense, you could say that it's constantly self-undermining, but then it has to re-territorialize, produce some new form of ideology or culture that's going to interpolate or subjectivize people back into same dynamic. But I think that Zizek's way of seeing this, I think, is much more useful to me, because it's not so much only society doesn't exist and there's only culture, but that there's an important dynamic that exists between the two. If we conceive society constantly as fissured by class struggle as a material contradiction, and I say material contradiction in the sense that if we're talking about capitalism specifically, that it doesn't matter, yes, I'm sure there are some capitalists that are big bad people who want to do big bad things, and they exist, but as a structural position, the capitalist is enjoined to act in a particular way out of the risk of potentially losing their business, that they have to maximize profit in a certain way that sometimes involves investing in labor-saving technology and increasing proletarianization. At the same time, the proletariat, struggles to make gains, not because they're bad people that are greedy and want more, slice of the pie or whatever, but out of material necessity, the proletariat is forced to demand higher wages, more time off, better benefits, and so on. So these positions are diametrically opposed, and that's what creates a material contradiction within society. And various different cultural phases within capitalism are different expressions of the ideological dynamic by which this contradiction is coming to the fore. So I think that one thing that we can do looking at social media itself as an expression of this cultural ideological dynamic is use it as a mechanism for measuring the degree to which, or the stage at which, the class struggle as the social real, as the real of society, is developing in different ways. Does
I
that
mean,
kind of make
it's
sense?
yeah. So it's just basically emphasizing a socio-cultural relationship, a relationship between society and culture, and specifically here, maybe problematizing the idea of culture wars.
In a sense, I mean, I go back and forth on, how much I like this idea of culture war because I guess you could say the culture war is always just ideological struggle at the level of the superstructure, right? It's not as though, what people sometimes say, culture war has replaced class war. I don't really see it as, one or the other, but just as two sides of the same coin, if you want to put it this way. Culture war is really just ideological struggle vying for hegemony at the level of the superstructure, which is also expressive of another dynamic that's taking place in the infrastructure or the base in terms of the class struggle. And because, I mean, you can look at it, in a kind of a, a parallax way to, cite the way that Zizek does it, that you can either look at things from the perspective of the infrastructure, or you can look at things from the perspective of the superstructure. You can look at it in terms of class struggle, or you can look at it ideological or culture war. Um, but when you do that, I think it's important to recognize that they don't always graft onto each other as easily as it might appear. So I think that some people might imagine that, the culture, the class struggle of the proletariat grafts on very easily to the ideological struggle of the left, generally speaking, or that capital grafts onto the culture war of the right. I'm not convinced that these are direct parallels between the two positions, because I think that there's something about the dynamics of right-wing rhetoric that appeals in a certain way and interpolates in a certain way the proletariat and the class struggle, whereas I think that a lot of left rhetoric in the culture war at the superstructural level can graft on in some ways to the liberal bourgeoisie in the class struggle in different ways. So I think that if we're going to talk in terms of culture war, I think it's always important to talk about it in terms of the level of the superstructure, in terms of level of ideological dispute vying for hegemony that is reflective in some way, but not perfectly grafted on to the class struggle dynamic at the level of the infrastructure. And again, just going back to social media platforms, I think that the way in which we see or perceive culture war disputes taking place on platforms like Twitter, let's say, I think in some ways masks or obscures the way in which the rhetorics we see on those spaces is connected to the actual form of the class struggle within capitalist society, capitalist infrastructure.
I mean, I'm super interested based on perhaps, not only this book, but your experiences on social media and just what you were saying about the way in which left and right-wing discourses don't necessarily map in a sort of clear way in regards to interpolation. I've been thinking more and more about left and right wing as sort of a derived from a spatial metaphor. And I was wondering if possibly one of the problems of the metaphor of the left wing and the right wing is that it doesn't take into consideration a temporal aspect, specifically in regards to I think what you were saying in your book about networks as spatializing time, or that it or that maybe more accurately these networks don't have a history, and maybe if that's disrupting the way in which we've conventionally understood left and right wing, sort of as a spatial metaphor derived from a time in which, these networks didn't exist or function in the same way.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I guess another way to think about it would be that this is a product in some sense of what's the Jean-Francois Lyotard line, the incredulity towards meta-narratives, the postmodern incredulity towards meta-narratives. I think that one of the reasons why social media and the internet more generally functions so well as a metaphor for, and as an historical metaphor for understanding the present, is because of the way that everything in digital spaces is spatialized. The time is spatialized in a certain way. And more specifically, I would say that history gets spatialized in a certain way. One of the examples I like to use sometimes to talk about, I guess, the difference between, say, a more modernist conception of time and history and a postmodernist conception, or I guess it's kind of bridging between post-structural and postmodern, is if you think in the modern sense of time and history, something like the time travel narrative. You think, Back to the Future, Marty McFly is going back and forth through time, and there's always that question about the contradiction, but the time paradox that's going to come up. If he changes something in the past, it's going to change something in the future. Whereas I think that the postmodern dynamics around space are something more like the parallel universe or the multiverse. I think of an old, maybe I'm the only one that remembers the show Sliders, where it's the same time, but they're just traveling back and forth between different parallel universes, right? And the parallel universes have their own time, right? They have their own time, but they never kind of contradict each other. They always kind of exist in a similar way. And I guess another good visual metaphor, I forget where I got this, but I love this metaphor. If you think about a movie like Christopher Nolan's Inception, where each layer of the dream has its own timescape, right? It has its own timescape. And it's almost like if, some of us, you have, 5, 6, 7 internet browsers open, right? And you go back and forth, you're sliding in between the parallel universes of the internet browser. Each has their own time, right? It has their own minor, time as opposed to major time, right? Not a meta narrative, but a local narrative. And you can go back and forth between them. And this is, I guess, a good way to think about the various different types of feedback loops and information bubbles, information silos that you get on platforms like social media platforms, where we exist in these different little local narratives, and there's never an encounter between them, right? There's never a moment where they can come to contradict each other. And if they do, then people regress back into their separate, left-wing or right-wing bubbles. Now, one of the reasons I have a problem with this spatial metaphor, as you put it, of left and right, well, there's a couple of things. One is I think that the left-right dynamic sort of creates the appearance that there's a parity, I guess you could say, on both the left and the right. I mean, that half the population is left, half the population is right, and you have this sort of parity. But what I also have a problem with is that both forms seem to be organized around endless negation, that these are both politics that are negating, that they're focused on negating something that they each see as authoritative, right? One of the other ways we can think about postmodernism, I guess, is if we imagine the culture of modernism as a culture of rebellion and resistance, the whole thing about, art for art's sake and make it new was one of the main ethics driving modernism. So that meant, from photography forward, let's say in the visual arts, that with photography, and you can have exact verisimilitude of the image that you're trying to capture, it sort of disrupts the significance of painting as a visual art. So painting invents itself as a new form of modern art, with Impressionism going up to Surrealism, Dadaism, abstract expressionism with Jackson Pollock. Now, these are all aesthetic forms that are built around negation, negation, negation of the form, and even negation or a vocation to not be commodity, right? One of the driving forces of modernism is let's not diffuse and become commodity. So when there's a potential for it to become commodity, mass-produced, popular culture, modern art has to distance itself or negate commodification. But we could say that postmodernism is the result of this project where, on the one hand, art and commodity fold into each other, that it's no longer possible for art to negate commodification. A classic example would be the pop art of Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol's Campbell's soup cans, for instance, are a great example of where commodity and art sort of blend into each other. But it's also this moment where, ideologically, where the art that's produced through negation resistance becomes the official art of the gallery, becomes the official art of the museum, becomes the official art of the university and criticism. Now, what happens then in a situation where the ruling ideology is the ideology of absolute interpolation by resistance? This is where you get, I think, in left and right, where both are positions of negation of what they perceive to be the authority, right? Each perceives the other to be authority and has to put in place, the other so that it can resist and negate. And never is there a politics, and this is, I'm getting to my point here, never is there a politics that is trying to center and defend something that we can put into place. Everyone is on the left in particular, afraid to become the authority, right? Afraid to take charge and to take power. Judith Butler's argument that the way in which we are produced as subjects is through being subjectivized against a power. Where there's power, there's resistance. And I think that that's the main driving ethic of both left and right politics today. Nobody is willing to risk the potential of a loss of a negation or a loss of this interpretive form of resistance. So that's a lot to throw out there, but I think that this is really the way to contextualize what's problematic about this binarizing dichotomy of left and right.
No, I think there's so much to chew on there. I mean, there's so many thoughts running through my mind. The one that's coming to my mind most powerfully is derived from a recent experience I had in London, where I was in the sort of I guess it's near the I guess it's near the big shopping center in London, and entire they had this entire section uh redesigned with Banksy art. And just all this Banksy art and merchandise, and there's this entire floor just filled with Banksy art, and it's just I just went in there for the spectacle of the absurdity of it, because it was just like, Banksy coffee mugs and t-shirts and posters, and just it's just exactly what you're talking about in terms of the art and the commodity blending into one, even when the art is just a pure resistance of what is going on in this situation. Yeah, and there's so many other threads of thought there, just in terms of, not uh both left and right being discourses of negation, not willing to occupy the center of power. I think Zizek has said that about Foucauldian sort of politics, wanting to be on the margins, wanting to be on the periphery, not willing to take the center. This working through this return from Marx to Hegel, because is there something wrong in the leftist drive for taking the center of power with, of course, state communism, and how do we reapproach those conversations of taking power, so to speak?
But
I'm
I
even
mean,
thinking.
just to jump in quickly, I mean, one of the
Yeah.
things that I think is typical of a left that sees itself as sort of the moral self-consciousness of society, and is often driven by this practice, very much in that Foucauldian sense of being anti-normative, right? Anti-normativity is one of the driving ethics of the left, I would say today, the non-dialectical and non-Marxist left, although, some Marxists, very much are built around this anti-normativity. But I get this from even somebody like Reza Negarestani, that this idea that every challenge to the norm is at the same time the production of a new norm. And I think rather than trying to be anti-normative, I think the materialist practice should be that we should produce and build new historical norms. I think that by building new historical norms that are tied into a universalist ethic, I think is the way to materially produce a society that is more globally free, right? Rather than constantly enacting this politics of constant negation. And even when you enact this politics of negation, all you're doing is at the same time propping up the power that you oppose, right? So there's never really any, authentic emancipation that comes out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about where the discourse is in regards to sort of, let's say, mainstream narratives of left and right. I mean, if you took, for example, the average sort of conversation on Jordan Peterson's channel, there's always this negation of the woke there's always this negation of woke agenda, and then on the left, I suppose there would be forms of negation related to whether it's the alt-right or whatever other form of extreme politics is sort of structuring that negation. But I mean, I think that in terms of coming up with a new norm, I wonder if this has any relationship to your what you call a basic thesis in your book, which is a play on Lacan's "do not sort of abandon your desire." You sort of say, "Do not abandon the algorithm of your desire." In regards to social media as a metaphor, I was wondering, is there any connection there with sort of, the idea of a new normativity and sort of affirming social media as a metaphor, and in relationship to not abandoning our desire?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I guess the way that I interpret Lacan's dictum that the only thing that one can be guilty of is giving ground relative to one's desire. I think that I'm paraphrasing that appropriately. The way that I read it is that in the pursuit, one of the things that I think is difficult for people to grapple with is and this goes to, the dynamics between desire and fantasy and drive and jouissance or enjoyment, is that this logic of not giving way to your desire. It is this constant process of negation, negation, negation. I mean, there is something in the pursuit of desire, and in the Lacanian sense, we're talking about a desire that is structured around a constitutively lost object. That, if I can, I'll try to put it this way. And it was funny because I was just reading Frank Ruta's new book. I think it's Freedom and Indifference. I think that's the title of it, from Fordham UP. And at the beginning, there's this section he's talking about Sartre's critique of Descartes, that part of the idea of freedom involves this choice of a yes or a no, an affirmation or a negation. And part of the way that I imagine or think about subjectivization in the Lacanian sense, and this is drawing on Zizek too, is that so the subject emerges as this foundational forced choice of being, whether we affirm or negate our relationship to the other. And in the process of um, affirming our relationship to the gaze of the other, we're at the same time simultaneously always in the process of negating all of the other options that we could be. That part of the process of subjectivization is I choose a particular, let's say, a signifier, right? I choose a particular way that I'm going to identify and present myself to the other out of the whole range of possibilities. But in making that single choice, that affirmative choice, I'm at the same time simultaneously negating all of the other options that I could have had, I could have chosen, right? And that negation of all those other options is the way in which desire, in a sense, is formed. That it's the rejection, it's the negation, and that's what makes that, the objet petit, that initial object cause of desire, constitutively lost. Now, in the fantasy, what happens is we imagine that this lost object is something that is objective, that I can find it, I can grab it, I can get it at a certain point. And the entire course of the process of not giving ground to your desire is in negating that initial affirmative choice that we made in the pursuit of this lost object, which doesn't actually exist. It doesn't actually have concrete existence. So it's this constant process of negation, negation, negation. I get this object, I think it's it, it's not it. I negate it, I go for another one. I get another object, I think it's it, I realize it's not it, I discard it, I go for another one. And the same thing happens with relationships. I go out with this girl or this guy or whatever, and I think that they're going to be the love of my life, but holy shit, no, they're not. I negate them and I go for another one. It's this constant process of negation, 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 negation. Now, what comes at the end of that process, and this is what I think is important, is reconciling with the fact that there is no object that will ever satisfy, and that the enjoyment that we're getting in that pursuit, the enjoyment of the drive, we could say, only comes via the fantasy. That enjoyment is only ever possible via the fantasy. So this ethic of not giving way relative to your desire is this process of having to go through this constant negation to arrive in the Hegelian sense at this moment of a negation of the negation, to recognize, to reconcile with the fact that no positive object is ever going to be the object that I appear to desire. And what I have to affirm and grapple with is that the initial choice that was made of the negation and the affirmation was my own. I have to assume it subjectively. Now, I kind of play around with this. I mean, this is the process of, that the algorithm is going to, in some ways, it reads our desire, to cite, Joan Kopchak's line, right? It reads our desire in the sense that part of the way for me the platform works is by constantly keeping our desire at a distance from us. It lures us at the level of our desire and brings us back by constantly keeping us, imagining that we can get it, right? And this is another way that time is spatialized on the platform, right? The temporal dimension is, I think that there's going to be this end point that I can get the thing that I desire, but it's actually spatialized in the way that I'm constantly just pursuing it, in an endless, flat, horizontal existence. And the culmination of that is the reconciliation, the recognition that I'm never going to achieve it. And as I'm saying this, I think I'm also at the same time in some ways justifying my own recent action of deactivating my Twitter, right? That they're, coming to this point that no longer relying on the big other, and recognizing that I'll never achieve and grab that lost object. But the other side of that too is that I still, one of the thing that comes in the process of the analytical resolution is the production of a new master signifier, right? And that's always, every destruction of a structure is always a production of a new structure. But I still think it's important to maintain confidence in the use of the term social media, because again, by sticking to that metaphor, by sticking to that signifier, this is how we can continue to pursue that object, but at the end come to grapple with the fact that social media, we only understand it as antisocial insofar as the concept of social media imagines that it's going to be this harmonious utopian space. So that's part of, I guess, what I mean when I'm talking about, do not give way to the algorithm of your desire.
Do you feel like you're living in a wasteland of thought? Philosophy Portal is a thinking community, a thought oasis in a wasteland of thought. Now we're launching a thinking portal, a live event space aiming to facilitate dynamic connections, creating open but contained and focused spaces to test and work with new ideas. Our live event space will feature 4 different events every month, all structured by one theme. Concept Cave to learn fundamental concepts. The Edge to meet active practitioners. Thought Lab to be inspired by core thinkers. And Real Talk, a space for personal relation to these ideas. Members not only get access to our 4 live events monthly, but also access to our private forum, receive discounts on our recorded and live courses, as well as priority access to apply for retreats. Welcome to the Thinking Portal. We hope you join us in 2024. Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, and it's to me super important to think about the way in which our culture is entering into this dizzying, spurious infinity of new objects of desire that are just, never it. Actually, there's a great potential here, which is the potential of the drive, and it may be a deeper relationship to the drive, maybe in a way that we've never seen before, in the sense that we've never been exposed to the spurious infinity of desire in such a radical way, or such a intense way, and there is something there that might be emancipatory. So it actually brings me to the next, just really naturally brings me to the next central question I wanted to ask, and what I thought was a really core aspect of the book was, you say, phrasing it as a question here, you say, what does it mean to truly realize the concept of social media? And I was wondering about this. What does it really mean to realize that concept? And you say that it involves bringing to the surface the lack of the social realm. So I just wonder if this is directly connected to what you're saying, and then also to bring in sort of the relationship to clinical structures. You say that the fetish is concealing the lack of the symbolic order, and I wonder if in the contemporary matrix of social, I think about figures like Andrew Tate or something like that as becoming super popular. I wonder if these are precisely fetishized objects concealing the lack in the social order, symptoms of the social order, basically saying, there is ways to get rich quick by doing no work, or basically doing silly work. So I'm just trying to play around here with, does realizing social media have something to do with a transition from desire to drive, in sort of the recognition that we are never going to actualize sort of the fundamental fantasy of our desire?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And this was sort of I think the conclusion that I was driving towards in the book, that again, part of this process of not giving ground relative to one's desire involves sticking to the social media metaphor. But there's again this way of thinking about the movement from, I guess you could say, an idealism towards a materialism, or the movement from a conscious or a subjective transformation, that moment of subjective destitution, moving from subjective destitution to the material act, right? And the act doesn't have to be, in the Marxist sense, a kind of a material transformation. The act itself can simply be a discarding of the prior framework according to which we recognize and understand ourselves relative to the functioning of the big other. But in a more material sense, what I do have in mind is, if because when I was writing the book, and I was writing the book over a period of several years, and in that time, and really one of the main inspirations for my writing about social media was something like the Occupy Wall Street movement, and what people saw as, the return to this new viable digital online public sphere. Social media scholars like Christian Fuchs, for instance, wrote a book about social media and the Occupy Wall Street movement. And there was a lot of conversations about, should we have, alternative platforms? Should we have, different platforms that are not the corporate social media platforms? Even today, people are, navigating away from Twitter and going to sites like Blue Sky, or there was a period when people were very interested in Mastodon. I remember several years ago now, people were trying to move away from Facebook to, there was a new one, titled after the algorithm, the ELO platform, that people went on and then just abandoned and returned back to the same corporate social media platforms. So part of what I'm arguing here is that we shouldn't just, try to create new social media platforms that are apart from corporate social media platforms. And I think there's even kind of a libertarian or anarchist bent to this idea that we can, develop our new autonomous collectives outside of the space of the corporate platform. And every time it seems to implode and fail in a certain way, people always return back to the corporate platforms. So part of this idea of, taking the metaphor all the way to the end is to inspire, in the same way. Again, I'm drawing on Marx's methodology and Capital here, in the same way as he's producing a material and imminent critique of the bourgeois ideology of freedom and equality. There's a sense that at the end of the process of thinking the concept, freedom and equality, that you have to actually build and produce a new infrastructure that's going to realize in another new way the potentiality of those goods that are advocated in the bourgeois ideology. And even in the same sense, somebody like George Lukács, in his, it's got a lot of discussion going on right now because of the new publication by Verso of his Destruction of Reason. That part of what Lukács is arguing is that bourgeois freedom, at a certain point, starts to turn into its opposite and become unfreedom, and that turns into forms of irrationalism that start to develop irrationalism and turns towards new forms of vitalism, that take precedence over reason as a form. And I'm with Lukács here. I mean, the idea for me is to keep pushing forward. Don't give way on your demand for freedom and equality, but make it material. Don't give up on your desire to have a truly social media platform, but what do we have to change in the society, not on the platform, right? Not changing the platforms themselves, which I think a lot of, internet politics is about. Let's change the platforms or create different policies that are going to encourage the platforms to act in a certain way. The point that I'm trying to make is that the only way to realize a kind of a social media that lives up to its name would be to produce a society where it would no longer even be required, right? That you change the infrastructure of the society, that will hopefully produce an equal transformation in the superstructure, if I'm being a vulgar Marxist, right? That by sticking to this idea of social media and trying to take it all the way to its end, that you can't just change the platforms, right? But you can try to change and transform the society in which the platforms exist that would hopefully have a mirrored transformation at that level as well.
Am I right in saying you'd have to change the base, like it's a base superstructure relationship?
Well, yeah, yeah, and no. So, I mean, I'm a little bit, one of the reasons why I say yes and no is because I guess I'm a little bit, well, I was joking a long time ago with Todd McGowan that in some ways I feel like this book, there's an element that's a little too Maoist. And I say it's a little too Maoist because later and I don't mean overtly, but I guess in its form, and this was sort of an unconscious thing, but later in the book, I make this argument with regards to platforms like Tinder, right? With the swipe left, swipe right logic, that we're talking about a simple relation of affirmation and negation. One of the things that Mao says is there's no such thing as the negation of the negation. There's only affirmation, negation, affirmation, negation. But one of the things that I think is useful in Mao's interpretation of the dialectic and his sense of primary and secondary contradictions is the way he thinks about the difference between the superstructure and the infrastructure. And even though I very much disagree with the idea of the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, that you develop the superstructure via purges, I do think that it's necessary to think about ways to develop the superstructure as a prior moment to the transformation of the infrastructure. And if we're talking about social media and the liberal public sphere, more specifically, I think that part of the problem that we're even seeing today in what we call culture war is this constant attempt at purges on both sides, that there's this attempt to create culture war at the level of the superstructure via different forms of purges, cancel culture, censorship, and all of those things. Whereas what we should really be doing is using these platforms to extend the level of debate. One of the things that Zizek has said recently is one form of cancel culture is not just canceling a particular speaker, but canceling a debate itself. One of the things that was so valuable to me in working on the debate between Zizek and Peterson is that we see that's not by ignoring the opposing view, but actually encountering them, not canceling, but by debating and taking that logic all the way to its end point. And if we take the logic of the liberal or bourgeois public sphere all the way to its end point to realize the potential that it's trying to achieve, we come to recognize that only by developing the superstructure in that way can we inspire some kind of transformation in the material infrastructure, right? So it's not just a matter of going quickly or too quickly to try to change the infrastructure, but it's a matter of developing the superstructure and the superstructural form all the way to its limit point, at which point, if it wants to preserve what it finds valuable at the level of freedom, reason, equity, and all of those things, right? If we want to preserve those things, then we're going to have to create an equal transformation in the material infrastructure of the society, right? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm specifically here getting the idea that if canceling is like a negation, could we think about debate as the negation of the negation?
Um,
Or are we just thinking here
I'm
in terms of like canceling is negation, debating is affirmation? Because
No, I guess what you mean, I think that's a great point, right? And I'm thinking about it. I don't have my
Yeah.
spontaneous sort of response would be that in debate, right? In a debate, it's not just about negation, as you say, or canceling as negation, but what I think is important, this is where I think the Hegelian form of the negation of the negation is better developed than the Marxist conception of the negation of the negation. Right? Remember, even in the early and later Marx, I mean, the negation of the negation, I think, is much more of it tries to take the idealism of Hegel and transform it into a materialism. And I think that that often conceived in terms of for Hegel, the idea is that the primary negation is a negation from spirit back down to the material world, and the negation of the negation is a movement from the material world back up into the world of spirit or the world of ideas. And Marx reverses that so that you have an initial material that is negated into the realm of ideas, and the negation of the negation is a movement back towards the material. But I think that that's too linear, and I think that it's too simple, because for me, what's significant about the negation of the negation is more of a subjective realization or a subjective recognition or subjective reconciliation. So that if we're thinking about it in the form of debate, right, what happens in debate is that in the process of encountering the external opposition that you receive from your interlocutor, you don't necessarily convince them, but you have a subjective transformation in your own position, right? You come back from the external position, right? You can move from, what is it, from the positing assumptions to the external reflection that you get in the debate with the other, back to a determinate reflection in yourself, so that what ends up being changed is your own subjective position. And I think that that's one of the ways that reason has to or should or can develop if we're considering how the realm of superstructural ideas can materialize in an infrastructural transformation. Right? Does that make sense? So it's not just cancel culture as negation and debate as negation of the negation. What happens in debate, from my perspective, is more so a subjective transformation that takes part, takes part, place, on the part of one's self, right? One's a sense of the material existence in which we're living.
I mean, I think even in some sense, the way you're framing that in terms of the transformation of the subject position is that you actually overcome the illusion of the external opposition, that
Absolutely.
you're the type of external cognition going on there. And I feel like a lot of the conflict on social media, a lot of the motivation for cancel culture is produced by external cognition, because you're not really putting yourself in the position where you could undergo a real subjective transformation, a real change in your subjective position. You're just sort of reifying an external cognition and then sort of moving on in your, like, I wanted to, and here's my chance to bring it up again. I loved your point about the parallel universes, because then you can just go back to your parallel universe as if there's no contradiction there. So, we don't engage with the contradiction.
Exactly, right. I totally agree with you, right? And what's interesting is the way that you see these, the personalities that develop on left and right on social media. I mean, it's almost as if you take away the content, the level of the form of the debate. I mean, there's so much similarity in the way that they, it is this. How did you put it? External cognition, right? And I mean, isn't that to me is exactly what's taking place with the production of the big other on social media? Because I mean, the big other is not just this sense, that we agree with the ideology of the big other, the supposed ideology of the big other, but think of it, even in the immature form of there's an Oedipal dimension to this, right? The struggle with the parent, that I'm struggling with the parent because I'm all the time trying to get my father, can't you see me, right? Father, can't you see me, mother, like the whole struggle is not just the big other that I incept the ideology, but I want the other to recognize me, right? Attention, give me the attention. One of the things that Zizek explains This is in the introduction, I think, to his collection called Mapping Ideology. That's different from the Althusserian conception of interpolation. I think that there's a typical way that people, it's all over the place in Foucault and Deleuze, who I think take this from Althusser as well. There's this sense that ideology is the internalization of some external contingent stimulus, right? So that we are interpolated, we internalize some external ideology. But what Zizek argues, and I think this is right, is that when interpolation is taking place, it's not a matter of internalizing the external ideology, but we have this inner deadlock, right? We have this inner deadlock tied to our jouissance, tied to the lack that is constitutive of our own subjectivity, and we want to externalize the inner contradiction, the inner deadlock. We externalize it by trying to have ourselves, by evading the lack, right? Evading the lack by externalizing this onto the form of the big other. And we were talking about fetishism, fetishization, a moment ago. And I think this is one of the ways that fetishism kind of operates in the space of social media and with regards to the big other itself, because we have to externalize this inner deadlock. We have to concretize this inner deadlock, this inner contradiction into some objective form. And this objective form, if we think about it in the form of perversion, this is what allows us to disavow the inherent lack that is constitutive of subjectivity. Right. So I like how you put it, it is this external cognition, right? That then part of the process of the negation is recognizing that this external form is also lacking itself, right? It's not just we who are lacking, we have to get recognition from the external source to cover up our lack. We recognize that they too are lacking. And in the process, we can then come back to ourselves and think, okay, well, I can reconcile with my own lack and I can try to move on from there, right? And grow and mature, if you want to talk about it in the Kantian sense of enlightenment.
Right. I mean, I think that this is a great place to bring up that you've mentioned it several times, but that one of the major themes in your book is that social media is functioning as a type of new big other. And the way you talk about it in the book is it leaves me with a lot of interesting ideas because, for example, because it's not just sort of we should disidentify with the big other, or that we should remove ourselves from the symbolic, but rather that it seems to me like social media is almost providing a new layer of normativity, a new symbolic level, which I think you say it's something like it dissolves actually the postmodern disorientation of a disconnection from the symbolic, of a sort of imaginary real relationship, and sort of reintroducing a symbolic normativity. Yeah, and I guess furthermore, building on that is that, like you brought up, we should think about this as having an Oedipal dimension to it. And I think you bring it up in the book, and I really wanted to get your opinion on this as well, is this decline of the paternal metaphor, decline of the father, and the decline of the symbolic, and is the emergence of social media the reconstitution of the symbolic, the reconstitution of the big other, presenting us with challenges to the paternal function? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So one of the keys to, and one of the impetus to writing the book too, was sort of this dynamic that exists. I mean, Zizek talks about it as a demise of symbolic efficiency in one of the later chapters in Ticklish Subject. But the person that really inspires me here is, again, Frederick Jameson in his early writing on postmodernism. And he talks about in his early essay in the book, the same title as well, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. And he's drawing again on post-structuralism and Deleuze and Guattari, especially the Capitalism and Schizophrenia books. Jameson describes postmodernism in Lacanian jargon as a breakdown of the signifying chain. Now, one of the ways that he explains that later on in the essay is referring to Althusser's theory of ideology. And Althusser, of course, people will know, describes ideology as an imaginary relationship or imaginary representation of the subject to its real conditions of existence. And what Jameson points out is that here you have this connection between the imaginary and the real that's forgetting the level of the symbolic. Now, one of the things that I like about this idea of the breakdown of the signifying chain as representative of what we call postmodernism is this form of constantly undermining every kind of unifying master signifier that holds potentially the ideological space together. And I think it overlaps with the way that Lyotard talks about the incredulity towards meta-narrative. We understand postmodernism as this disdain towards big meta-narratives, big explanations of everything. And you see this very much in a lot of left cultural or post-structural criticism of ideology, the idea that, we've reached an end of ideology, that there never was an ideology, even, in the, Derridian, deconstructive process of decentering, right? There's this constant undermining of the center. And that's part of what's productive of this postmodern breakdown of the signifying chain. Now, the problem with that is that when you critique or deconstruct or eliminate every form of meta or master narrative according to which the subject positions itself in the world and society, you end up with this sort of schizophrenic subjectivity that, doesn't really know who it is. I don't know who I am. I don't know where I belong. I don't know, where I exist, right? And there's something about that in the way that Zizek talks about the demise of symbolic efficiency, in the demise of symbolic efficiency as well, that I can no longer identify with a particular, paternal metaphor, or master signifier, or a position of authority. We see it very much in the postmodern consumer society, where consumer society is no longer prohibiting us from enjoying, it's constantly enjoining us to enjoy, right? The super code commandment, enjoy. Why are you not enjoying? You have no limitations, no prohibitions. There's no ideology anymore, right? There's no prohibition anymore. You can go out and enjoy. You're not even just allowed to enjoy, you're obligated to enjoy. And this creates a conundrum for the subject if we think about the space of the internet, right? Because the space of the internet is supposedly this free and open space where we can get anything we want, that everything is available, all information is available, but it makes it harder to navigate when there's no authority telling us what you should want, what you should desire, what you should look at on the internet. So there's the potential for desire to be suffocated in a certain way. But I think that what we start to realize is that it's very limiting, right? It's very limiting because the only way we can imagine the lost object of desire as existing is if it is prohibited, if there is some figure, the father figure, telling us, no, you're not allowed to have it, then we can imagine that it's potentially there and we just have to get rid of the father and we can get the desire of the mother, or whatever. But when we no longer have the prohibition, it makes it difficult to imagine what's stopping us from getting this thing. So I think that, again, Web 2.0, social media as the production of this new organized symbolic space of the internet, I think that subjectively or cognitively even helps to reproduce this sense of some kind of collective symbolic big other whose gaze that I'm trying to impress, or even in the sense we were talking about before, this externalized form of prohibition that I put in place as what makes possible my ability to imagine that the lost object is achievable. And this is also why I say that in some sense, you can say that this potential for a schizophrenic capitalism is evaded in the movement towards a new form of perversion, right? That perversion is this process of putting in place a power and authority that opposes me, because it's only in my attempt to transgress that prohibition that I'm able to garner any kind of enjoyment. Now, there's one other sense which I think that the symbolic is important here, and this comes again from Jameson, that what he's arguing in a sense with he talks about in terms of a return to narrative, a return to meta-narrative, is to think the form of the symbolic, not the symbolic as the big other, but the symbolic function of the interpretation or the analytical interpretation itself. And in the process of performing the analytical interpretation, what we end up doing is producing a new kind of symbolic narrative that can have a material implication in the way in which the subject is perceiving their own orientation towards desire, towards fantasy, and yes, even towards drive in a certain sense. I'm still very much on side with Zizek's political argument about the drive, that drive is ethical in a political sense, or political in an ethical sense, insofar as the moment of the traversal of the fantasy is the recognition, not that we get rid of the fantasy, but that we invest ourselves even more in the fantasy, because we realize that the lost object of desire doesn't actually exist out there in the world. It only exists in the fantasy, and then therefore enjoyment is only ever in the fantasy itself. So by producing this new symbolic orientation to the imaginary level of the fantasy, I think there's a potential to come to this moment of reconciliation towards a more authentic conception of our enjoyment, if that makes sense.
I have so many questions here, and I just want to throw a problematic and a contradiction that I've seen in sort of the cultural spaces that I'm associated with in regards to what I see as attempts to reestablish a paternal metaphor and to reconstitute a certain relationship to the symbolic in the way that you're talking about. I see on the one hand, and of course this is a simplistic representation just as a point of sort of conversation, is on the one hand, I see people trying to return to traditional narratives, oftentimes traditional narratives of Christianity, trying to establish some sort of trad life. And you can see this in the reproduction of what people will openly call postmodern traditionalists. Or what trad pomo, like, and we're gonna do the return to a traditional way of life. We're gonna go into a rural community. We're going to establish rural communal ties and so forth, and we're going to enact life before modernity. On the other hand, you have what I would call a turn to trying to sublate postmodernism with metamodernism. And metamodernists will try to create precisely what postmodernists are skeptical of, which is a meta-narrative. And they'll try to accommodate all of the other narratives, so like the modernist narratives and the pre-modernist narratives, and they create a whole sort of web of narratives which are apparently contained in the meta-narrative, which has higher order values, which precisely sublate what was lacking in modernism, sublate what was lacking in postmodernism for a higher order orientation, as that's the way to reconstitute the symbolic narrative. And I see a lot of that orientation coming from, for example, Ken Wilber and the integral movement originally, and then there's some other figures today who are trying to build on that or add to that. I wonder if you have any perspectives on the basic attempt to reestablish a paternal metaphor and to reconstitute a symbolic, either in this meta move or in a more traditionalist way.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult question. I mean, I haven't thought about it in those terms, but you're raising some very good points. And I guess, well, one thing I'll say is that I see myself very much as committed to the committed to modernism, committed to modernity, specifically committed to the Enlightenment project, and particularly the Enlightenment project aspects of reason, universality, freedom in a material sense. And that, I guess, for me is what orients my perspective on the various different examples that you're citing here. I think that what we can grasp as, what we sometimes call reactionary ideologies is a turn more towards a kind of a particularism as opposed to a universalism. So the examples you were saying of, this movement, back towards traditional pre-modern identities. I think that, my first thought, of course, is that there's a certain type of privilege, I guess, material privilege that comes with that, in the sense that I think there are many people who, by necessity, are reliant on the infrastructures that have been built by modern society. I'm thinking about not just informational necessities, but medical necessities, for instance, even in some sense, communal necessities that some people don't necessarily have the privilege to be able to, go off the grid, to use that, term, in that way. So that there's a privilege and a particularism that I think is connected to the ability to, return to that type of more traditional alternative, I guess alternative today, lifestyle. And I think that, we mentioned the paternal metaphor. I think there's even a reactionary element, to the need for these new types of father figures, whether it's Jordan Peterson or Donald Trump or whomever. I think that this is still a reactionary formation. I think when I talk about the constitution of the symbolic, it's not necessarily a return to, the paternal metaphor, a return to a pre-modern symbolic, but to the production of a new form, right? When we say sublation, right, we're at the same time, in the traditional sense, you're both negating and elevating, right? So you're making an attempt to reconcile with those aspects of the symbolic that you, or the culture of the society that you hope to negate, while preserving or elevating the dimensions you want to maintain. Um, what's that line? There's that line from one of the Star Wars movies I really like. We're going to win not by fighting what we hate, but by preserving what we love. And I think that that's one of the ways to think about the production, not of a return to an older symbolic order, but the production of a new one, right? That instead of thinking about a movement towards or a return to the paternal metaphor, we have to think in terms of the movement within the analytical discourse, which is ultimately, in the end, productive of a new master signifier. I think that the form of the master signifier is still something that is a necessity if we're talking about some kind of social or communal cohesion. But the content of that signifier, I think, is historically contingent. The signifier itself is necessary, but the content itself, the signified, if you will, is historically contingent. It can take different forms depending on the different needs of the society or the community. I think even here in terms of, Freud's civilization and its discontents, because one of the things that I love about Freud's argument is that in order, it might create, discontent and, painful feelings. The reality principle might create some painful feelings, but we come to recognize that we require its production if our goal is to preserve human universality. So for me, a lot of this is still, politically even oriented, towards the question, is your production of a symbolic or a narrative or what have you, what did you call it? Meta-modernism narrative, right? But any production of the narrative you have, for me, I guess the register would be, is your project aimed towards human universality, or is it aimed towards some form of localist or communalist particularism in what you're trying to produce, right? That's, to me, the difference between a politics that is reactionary versus one that is progressive.
I love that. Specifically that distinction, that's very helpful in regards to is it, but just what you said there. Are you aiming at human universality or some form of localist, communalist particularism? And I can say with, again, information which is derived from my sort of local cultural sort of engagement, that I do think both of the trad Christian movement that I see and the meta modern movement that I see are reactionary to localist, communalist particularization. in terms of what they're actually doing, and who they're actually sort of organizing their symbolic towards and practically engaging with. And I think that there is a certain obfuscation in that tendency to not reflect on the fact that both of those narratives, whatever form they are, don't actually have anything to say about real world conflicts, like, for example, Israel and Palestine. Like, it's just, that it's not like, oh, you have the meta modern narrative now, so now we can resolve these world historic conflicts. No, like, it doesn't help at all.
And I
You
just I
know?
just want to pick up on something there, as as you're speaking, because I'm thinking about this again. How do we conceive this? How do we conceive this moving from an idealist perspective to a materialist perspective? And if we're talking, one of the greatest tensions, I think, we're talking about this relation between a particular localism and human universality, is how do we conceive this difference between what you might call an opposition between different local or particular groups, right? You said Israel and Palestine. How can we think about the opposition between, the localism of Jewish Israeli or the localism of, Arab Palestinian, versus the form of realizing the universality in what is still an inner contradiction to both particular localisms, right? So going back to the debate example that we talked about, right, that there's an appearance of an opposition between the interlocutors in the debate. And that opposition is really just the grounds upon which, in the form of the negation of the negation, myself as an interlocutor in a debate, I can come to grapple with my own inner contradiction in the perspective that I am developing, and in the movement towards the new, I am producing something that is the result of my reconciliation with my own inner contradiction. If we take this to the form of the local particularisms, when they posit themselves merely as oppositional to some other local particularism, there's an evasion of trying to grapple with the inner contradiction that is central to that local particularism itself. And it's by taking on and addressing, in my view, by taking on and addressing the inner contradiction to the local particularism that is capable of developing the singular position that can manifest itself in some form of solidarity that is tied to a broader universalism, insofar as the inner contradiction or the lack or the negative is something that is universal across all local particularisms. In what I'm trying to address here, in the form of something like a new master signifier, is one that would be able to articulate what is constitutively lacking in all various local particularisms, by recognizing that all local particularisms are themselves also inner contradictory, self-contradictory, lacking, negative. Then I think that there is potential for bringing together something that is more universal in its recognition of a shared condition. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and I think we can go deeper here in regards to some of the claims that you're making in the book. So, I wanted to sort of comment on both your sort of approach to lack, negativity, like you're saying, sort of as there's all local particularisms are constitutively lacking, and sort of juxtapose that with some other, let's say, philosophical paradigms, which, you sort of situate yourself in relationship to, like, for example, the anti-Oedipus narrative, where we have a situation where lack is conceived as imposed, as artificial, as opposed to constitutive. Or I'm wondering here also about the relationship between your approach and, for example, the new materialist or the accelerationist approach as sort of symptoms of not sort of confronting universal negativity in the way that you're framing it. And maybe some ways this might have a huge impacts on sort of drive and politics.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I guess, I mean, and this comes to one of the ways that I'm trying to, or in the book, I try to conceive of what I call a new structuralism. And that's a structuralism that has lack or antagonism or negative or contradiction or gap as its heart. So it's that the structure that's organized around a constitutive lack, as opposed to the various different new materialist, um, or critical post-humanist types of perspectives that I think are, many of which are inspired by the anti-Oedipus project or the Capitalism and Schizophrenia project. And I guess for me, there's something about the idea of a pure immanence or pure immediacy that I think is idealist and essentialist. This idea that, I mean, if you think about what the project of, capitalism and schizophrenia or schizoanalysis is even about, it's about the deterritorialization or the deconstruction or the tearing down of every signifier, the despotic signifier, right? The tyranny of the despotic signifier. It's this project of constantly tearing down anything that's been erected, because what's been erected is seen as artificial, culture is artificial, the concept of the human is artificial, and that if we deconstruct it, we can get back down to some hard, objective material that precedes some false human subjectivization. And I again, just as the politics of pervert, I mean, it's kind of interesting dynamic between the schizoanalysis and perversion, right? But I think there is this sort of perverse project of constantly seeing the production of culture, the production of the symbolic, the production of the signifier as producing what is lacking. And if we only get rid of that, then we will no longer lack. I think that it's a very idealist way of thinking about a return to some kind of basic, essential material reality. And this is something I see in the new materialists, where even, there's a sort of a performative contradiction present in the work of somebody like Jane Bennett, right, who argues very much in favor of the need for a kind of a strategic anthropomorphism of the non-human as a way to create parity between human and non-human. But from my perspective, all that does is it still centers human construction, right? But anthropomorphism itself is the production of centering human subjective perspective and just assigning human qualities to the non-human as an effort to try to escape human social symbolic subjectivization. So from my perspective, all of these various attempts to get at some kind of hard, immediate reality, get rid of the representation. I think Althusser is guilty here too, right? Because by conceiving ideology as representation, right? Deleuze does this too, right? That representation is supposed to be the elimination of contradiction or the synthetical elimination of contradiction, so that we should try to, and Adorno too, with negative dialectics, it's this whole process of let's not have identity thinking. If we just maintain difference, if we just maintain then avoid all synthetical forms, then we can arrive at some kind of more authentic, objective, hard reality. But I think what I like about Zizek's ontology, to me, seems much more freeing and ethical, in the sense that for him, we have to think about reality as constitutively incomplete, that reality is constitutively lacking, right? We never know what the future is going to bring. We never know what our actions are going to bring. In every new instance, produces a condition where an act is necessary, but nevertheless, the form that act is going to take is contingent. There are no guarantees to the way that we're going to act. So there's something about this this notion that there is some essential, immediate, hard reality in the immanence of pure being that I just find is ethically concealing, right? It all it permits us to do is endless negation, endless criticism, endless tearing down, rather than making efforts to build up out of our things that we need, right? Building up out of necessity to produce freedom by building up rather than tearing down. There's a kind of what Anna Kornblue calls an anarcho-vitalism that is present in all of these projects of new materialism,
Yeah.
pure immediacy, that I think even disavows the subjective perspective from which it's speaking. Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology is another good example of this, because, in this claim that all things are objects of different types, what it disavows is the very subjective position that's required to even say this in the first place, right? And
Absolutely.
that's what I find difficult in all these projects that see lack as something imposed rather than constitutive.
I think so much here. I actually just finished teaching the Acree, and when I'm reflecting on the Acree in the context of what you're saying about anti-Oedipus in regards to the Schizo project being the tearing down of every signifier, I can't think of a more different project going on in Lacan's work in regards to the Acree and actually being in contact with the subject of the unconscious, and that you can't escape sort of your ethical subject position here, and sort of building from that perspective. And I mean, there's more to be said, but I just wanted to quickly note that your new structuralist project, emphasizing lack, antagonism, gap, or contradiction at the heart of whatever local particularism we're dealing with, to me, that's a ground to actually build a real symbolic. As opposed to, I think, what I was referring to previously with either the metamodernist project or the trad return, that they're the way in which I encounter those symbolics as fake, or that they actually haven't tarried with the real to derive their symbolic structure, that they're actually just they're basically, it's a premature constitution of the symbolic, as opposed to a real tarrying with the negativity, with the lack, the antagonism, in order to construct a new symbolic level or
I
something like
just
that.
jump in there, right? Because I mean, one of the things that is noteworthy about the kinds of projects you're describing, right? The meta modernist, or what's the other one? The return to the pre-modern, the traditional return to the pre-modern, is that these are projects that they can only exist insofar as they're reacting to some other form that they're trying to negate, right? If you got rid of that, then they'd have no more raison d'être, right? That they only exist in opposition to some other thing that they're trying to leave. But once that thing is gone, then they no longer have any, grounds upon just to stand upon.
I think, yeah, you're exactly correct. So like with the meta-modernists, the reaction would be the postmodern. They need the postmodernists. And then the trad Christians, they need I think either it's the progressive left, or it's some form of accelerationist
And
move.
that's what makes them both reactionary.
Yeah, they're reactionary. So I think we can conclude on that point, and I just want to sort of emphasize that your approach of new structuralism does point us in a direction which does allow us to work with the symbolic. It does allow us to think through metaphor, and I think in a way that you're actually demonstrating in your book, in terms of bringing your subject position into it, because you're actually working with the concept of the social media as a metaphor, and let's work through it instead of just encountering the contradiction like we started with, and just saying that and saying that's a bunk concept, right? We work with the contradiction. So I think so for people who are interested in checking out your work, I highly recommend algorithmic desire, and just want to re-emphasize that this approach of new structuralism, I think, does have a lot of carries a lot of weight in this larger field, like in relationship to the new materialisms or the object-oriented ontology, or like I was emphasizing, the other approaches of meta-modernism or trad reactionism. There is sort of another way of thinking here, which I think that you've done a great job also of confronting very contemporary issues with the internet and algorithmic desire. So, I guess I'll just say to you, um, is there anything you'd like to leave the viewers with, whether it's sort of thoughts on algorithmic desire, or where they can pick up your work, or investigate further if they're interested?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, if anybody is interested in seeing some more of my work, you can go to my website, matthewflisfeder.com. I said I've got my Instagram account that's going, and I'm posting some things I'm reading, things I'm working on. One of the interesting things that's developed since I finished this book, my new project, which is kind of I've moved from talking about a new structuralism to now trying to imagine a new humanism, which for people, so coming out of both being inspired by, but also critically reacting to the work of Louis Althusser, as well as a lot of the contemporary post-humanisms. One of the things I'm trying to do now is moving from this idea of a new structuralism, a structuralism based on lack and gap, to trying to rethink a materialist and dialectical conception of humanism that's also based on this idea of a constitutive lack or constitutive alienation in the form of human subjectivity. And that's what I'm working on now. So if people are interested, you can check out my work at my website or some of the social media posts that I have there.
All right. Fantastic. So for all the viewers who are still with us, I'm Cadell Lasta here with Dr. Matthew Flisfader. I'll leave links in the description to both Algorithmic Desire as well as Matthew's website and Instagram. And thanks for coming on, Matthew. I think this has been a great chat.
Thanks for having me on, Cadell. I really enjoyed it.
Do you feel like you're living in a wasteland of thought? Philosophy Portal is a thinking community, a thought oasis in a wasteland of thought. Now we're launching a thinking portal, a live event space aiming to facilitate dynamic connections, creating open but contained and focused spaces to test and work with new ideas. Our live event space will feature 4 different events every month, all structured by one theme. Concept Cave to learn fundamental concepts. The Edge to meet active practitioners. Thought Lab to be inspired by core thinkers. And Real Talk, a space for personal relation to these ideas. Members not only get access to our 4 live events monthly, but also access to our private forum, receive discounts on our recorded and live courses, as well as priority access to apply for retreats. Welcome to the Thinking Portal. We hope you join us in 2024. For courses exploring the foundation of modern philosophy, as well as live events bringing philosophy to life, visit Philosophy Portal online and become a member today. Throughout 2024, our members get access to 4 monthly events. In January, we focus on the concept of libido and welcome guests Layman Pascal, Alenka Zupancic, and Elliot Rosenstock. Find out more at philosophyportal.online.